Hi, everybody. Today, April 5th, we are working on Chapter 9 of the U.S. History book, sections 1 and 2. So, hoy vamos a tener la presentación sobre el capítulo 9 del texto de historia, las secciones 1 y 2. So, deja compartir. Ustedes lo están viendo. Deja abrir esto. Okay. And everybody's seeing this okay now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, we have the I love the timelines. So this is kind of cool because this shows us the order, the kind of timeline of how industrialization starts. So, me gusta esta línea de tiempo porque nos enseña las invenciones y la progresión de la industrialización temprana, no? So we have el buque a vapor, we have the steamboat in 1807. Luego Francis Cabot Lowell empieza con sus fábricas de textiles. So Francis Cabot Lowell with his textile factories. Después hablamos del pánico. We'll talk about the panic a little bit later. Están haciendo nuevos modos de transportación. So we have new modes of travel. Just think, we construct these canals and we have steamboats that can run on them, right? Construimos canales y luego hay los buques de vapor que pueden estar ahí, usarlos para viajar. We have the mechanical reaper, el segador mecánico, el empiezo de los trenes, right? The beginning of trains. The steam locomotive replaces the horse-drawn locomotive. And we have the first telegraph, el primer telégrafo, con el código Morse, right? With the Morse code in 1838. And then we have the circus. No, the American Museum. Oh, esos museos de cosas raras. The museums with strange things in them. Kind of like Ripley's Believe It or Not. Okay. Oops. Wait. Oh, I see. I gotta go down here. Sorry. Okay. So, primeros cambios a la fabricación y el trabajo. We're getting the first changes to manufacturing and work during this time. So before 1800, consumer goods were manufactured. The manufacture of consumer goods took place in workshops, artisan workshops. And you had a workshop where there was a main artisan, and then there were journeyman artisans, and there were apprentices. So if you were a young person, you began as an apprentice under an artisan. Later, you became a journeyman, and then eventually you had enough experience and skill to be considered a skilled artisan, and you could open your own shop. So, antes de 1800, la fabricación de bienes consumibles tomaba lugar en talleres de artesanos hábiles. El encargado del taller era el artesano, quien tenía más experiencia, habiendo pasado por ser aprendiz y luego oficial. So, uno de joven empezaba como aprendiz, después pasaba a ser oficial, quizás oficiante, no sé, pero dice oficial. Oficial, y luego, después de tener experiencia y maestría, pasan a ser artesanos hábiles. Llegando a ser artesano hábil, uno podría abrir su propio taller. All right. But merchants wanted to lower the price of manufacturing so that they could earn more profit, of course. So they started to divide manufacturing into small steps, small repetitive steps that didn't require really any training or skill to do. So, for example, you might have a family cutting out the soles of shoes. They were given standardized patterns and they would just have the pieces of leather and they would just cut out the soles. They gave this work to families of farmers who did it when they didn't have work in their fields. So when they were, a lot of times in the winter, farmers didn't have much to do in their fields, and so they might do this work at home in their family. So los mercantes querían bajar el precio de la fabricación para quedarse con más lucro. Estaban pagando artesanos hábiles si querían comprar cosas para vender. Para quedarse con más lucro, dijeron, pues quizás hay otra manera de fabricar las cosas. Empezaron a dividir la fabricación en pasos pequeños y repetitivos que no requerían entrenamiento. Daban ese trabajo a las familias de granjeros que lo hacían cuando no tenían trabajo en sus campos. Por ejemplo, en el invierno muchas veces los granjeros no tenían qué hacer en el campo y esos mercantes hacían algo, por ejemplo, ok, queremos que hacen las suelas de los zapatos. Les daban el cuero, hay otra palabra, les daban el material y luego quizás un patrón y les decían, ok, van a cortar estas suelas según el patrón. No tomaba realmente entrenamiento ni habilidad, simplemente la materia y el patrón, right? Um, so eso les ayudó algo a las familias de los granjeros porque así tenían un poco de ingreso extra. In Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the first textile factories employed families. So they would employ the whole family. The father would be like the boss, he'd be the head of everything. And everyone else would work for him, but they would work in the factory. So they might have, 10 families working in the factory. They didn't get a salary, they didn't get wages. Instead, they got credit towards their rent because these factories, the houses were owned by the owner of the factory and they rented these houses out. And they also had company stores. And so they didn't get money that they could go spend where they wanted to, but their work was credited towards their purchases in the store. So their whole life kind of revolved around the factory. En Massachusetts y Rhode Island, las primeras fábricas de textiles empleaban familias. El padre servía como el encargado. So, en una fábrica quizás tendrían 8 o 10 familias trabajando con el padre como el encargado y los hijos y la esposa trabajando con él y para él. Esas familias no recibían sueldo, sino crédito para su renta en las casas del dueño, porque el mismo dueño de la fábrica también era dueño del alojamiento y también tenían tiendas de la compañía donde ellos podrían no comprar cosas con dinero, sino que tenían crédito en la tienda para conseguir sus bienes ahí. All right. Let me see what's in the chat. Okay. Okay. Las fábricas y los pueblos de fábricas. Francis Cabot Lowell. So, Francis Cabot Lowell era un mercante. Él fue a Inglaterra e hizo turismo de las fábricas de textiles y memorizó los diseños de las máquinas para fabricar la tela de algodón. O sea, los británicos no estaban compartiendo sus diseños con nadie. Tenían sus diseños para las máquinas y no los compartían. Pero este fue a hacer un tour y memorizó los diseños. Formó una asociación de mercantes llamado Boston Associates y juntos construyeron fábricas de textiles. Creo que en el texto dice que pudieron recaudar $400,000 para empezar, para construir 2 fábricas. primero. El trabajo fue mecanizado y requería poca habilidad para hacerlo. Así podían pagar mucho menos a los trabajadores. All right, so factories and factory towns. So Hershey's is a famous factory town, actually, in Pennsylvania. Came later, though. Francis Cabot Lowell was a merchant in the United States, and he went over to Great Britain to make a tour of the cotton mills there. Now, the British were not sharing the designs for their cotton mill machines with anybody. But this Francis Cabot Lowell went over there and took tours and memorized the designs for the machines and brought to make cotton cloth. And he came back and was able to construct these machines. So then he formed an association of merchants called the Boston Associates, and together they raised $400,000 and constructed two factories, two textile factories. Later there were more, but this is how they began. So the work was mechanized and did not really require any skill to do it. So this allowed them to pay the workers much, much less than they had to pay skilled artisans. Para poder vigilar los trabajadores, construyeron pueblos en que vivieran. Diseñaron los pueblos para que parecieran como otros pueblos de New England. Tenían jardines con flores, hicieron las fábricas en un estilo bonito de tabique. Con ventanas grandes para que parecieran otro tipo de edificio. Oh, porque no querían, bueno, imagino que querían mantener la vista bonita de New England. Debido a la competencia de granjeros que habían trasladado al oeste, los granjeros de New England enfrentaban más competición. So, ya no podían vender en el mismo precio sus productos y muchos estaban pues con necesidad de ganar dinero. So, muchos jóvenes vieron que no iba a haber mucho futuro en la granja y fueron a las fábricas de textiles en búsqueda de trabajo. Y esos trabajos eran disponibles también para mujeres y no solo para hombres, aunque los trabajos de las mujeres eran más limitados que los de los hombres. So, las mujeres que encontraban trabajo ahí vivían en dormitorios, eran solteras o viudas y tenían muchas reglas para proteger su virtud, dado que los mercantes fueron a buscar gente que trabajara y cuando se acercaba a las familias de los granjeros, ellos también querían saber que sus hijas iban a estar protegidas viviendo fuera de su casa, lejos de su casa. All right. So, in order to watch over their workers, these merchants or the new manufacturers created factory towns for them to live in. You remember that some of them were only getting credit, so they had to live in the company housing because they didn't have money to pay for other housing, right? They designed these towns, the factory towns, so that they would look like other towns in New England. They planted flower beds. The factories were made of red brick and had big windows, and they tried to make the buildings look not so much like just a big box, but to have some beauty to them. And so, how did they get workers? Well, once the West opened up for people to go there, a lot of people left, and it turned out that the land in the Northwest, like in the Ohio area, was very good for producing grain and other agricultural products. And so farmers in New England started to have more competition, and the prices of their products went down, which left them needing more money. So many young people in New England realized that being on the farm was not going to be a good future, and so they went to textile factories looking for work. And this work was open to both men and women. The jobs for women were more limited than the jobs for men, but women didn't encounter jobs there. And so this created, it's interesting because on the one hand, it's kind of it's exploitative, but on the other hand, it's giving women opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Eso no lo dije en español. Es un interesante porque el trabajo para las mujeres de una manera sí es la explotación. Las explotaban, las pagaban menos. Y por eso querían que mujeres trabajaran para pagarles menos. Las estaban explotando. Pero por otra parte, muchas de esas mujeres ya encontraron una vida nueva, trabajando fuera de sus casas. Antes habían quedado en casa hasta casarse. So, nunca tenían la oportunidad de ganar su propia dinero, de estar un poco independientes, right? So women who, previously most women they stayed home until they got married. So this is giving these farm girls the chance to actually live somewhat independently, not completely because they lived in these dormitories. They had to be single or widowed, and they had a lot of rules to protect their virtue, right? They couldn't have guests. Who they hung out with was monitored. If they were found hanging around with people who were considered of ill repute, then they might lose their job. Okay. El consumismo y la transformación del trabajo. Consumerism and the transformation of work. The prices of many goods went down because of the new methods of manufacturing, and people could afford to buy themselves small luxuries. It was easier for many people to buy their necessities as well, and then on top of that, now they could afford maybe some small little luxuries. But and of course capitalism needs people to be consuming in order to function, right? Consumption drives capitalism. And so when things are working well, this is just great. Before this time, work okay, so this leads to a transformation in work, right? Before this time, work was more under the control of the workers. The owner of a workshop, right, uh, could say, well, I'm not going to work today. We're not going to work today. We'll work tomorrow, or let's close early today. Sometimes they drank while they were working. They drank alcoholic beverages at work. In fact, some employers, part of people's salary was even alcoholic beverages. They took breaks when they wanted to. Maybe not so much apprentices and journeymen, but the work pace was much more relaxed, let's say that. If they wanted to open the doors and windows, they could do it. And work stopped once it got too dark to see, which they didn't have electric lights. They had candles and oil lamps, but they didn't use those to work by. Once it got dark, that was it. Work was over. So, hay una transformación muy grande en el trabajo, en cómo es el trabajo para los trabajadores. Antes, el trabajo era más bajo el control de los trabajadores. Un dueño, un artesano podía decidir cuándo trabajaba, podía decidir cuándo hacía una cosa u otra. Si tenía que reparar una cerca, podía decir, no lo hago hoy, lo hago pasado mañana. Muchas veces tomaban mientras trabajaban en esos talleres, y hasta muchos empleadores pagaban por una parte con alcohol. Tomaban los descansos cuando querían. probablemente no los aprendices y oficiales, pero si el artesano decía vamos a tomar un break, tomaban un break. Si querían abrir las puertas y ventanas, podían hacerlo. A veces abrían todas las puertas y ventanas mientras trabajaban. El trabajo paraba cuando ya era demasiado oscuro para ver. O sea, tenían velas y tenían lámparas de aceite, pero no los usaban para trabajar. All right. So then we have the factory. In the factory, workers worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were very limited. Their freedom was very, very limited. They could not drink alcoholic beverages, which I have to say, I think that's actually probably a good idea when working around heavy machinery. Uh, in many factories, they weren't allowed to sit down. So 10 to 12 hours a day on your feet, 6 days a week. And breaks were only given at certain times. And most of you probably have a job like this. Maybe not exactly like this, but does this look familiar? You know, you get your break at a certain time. It's always a certain amount of time, right? You don't get to just say, "Hey, you know what? We're having a good time at lunch today. Let's sit around and talk a little longer." Which
Well, there are no minimum wages, that kind of things, right?
yeah, they didn't have minimum wage at that time. Yeah.
Or no paid vacation, that kind of things too, right?
Oh,
Either.
no, none of that. None of that. No,
Okay.
no, no. And no safety measures. So we're going to get to that too, a little bit about organizing workers, early organization of workers, right? So en las fábricas el trabajo cambia completamente, ya es muy diferente, la libertad, ya no hay libertad casi. Trabajan 10 a 12 horas por día, 6 días la semana. Limitaron mucho la libertad de los trabajadores. Antes, cuando podían tomar en el trabajo, ya no. Aunque tengo que decir que siento es mejor que no estén tomando alcohol cuando están trabajando con máquinas pesadas. So de cierto modo es algo para estar más seguros. Pero en muchas fábricas no podían sentarse 10 a 12 horas por día, 6 días la semana sin poder sentarse. Y uno tiene que tomarse en cuenta que los niños estaban trabajando también. The other thing is kids were working, right? It's not just adults, children, young children. 6 years old. Y los descansos se regulaban como hoy en día. Tienes 10 minutos por la mañana, media hora para el almuerzo y 10 minutos por la tarde, igual que ahora. No como antes en el taller, si estaban teniendo una buena conversación, podían tomar unos 10, 15 minutos más. No, ahora no. Todo se regula mucho. Las fábricas eran sucias y peligrosas. En una fábrica de textiles hay mucho, mucho polvo. No sé si saben eso. Crea mucho polvo. Hubo mucho polvo. De noche habían lámparas de aceite al lado de los baúles de algodón. O sea, ya como trabajan 10 a 12 horas por día, pueden imaginar que en el invierno no hay tantas horas de luz. So están prendiendo lámparas de aceite y están al lado de los baúles de algodón. Hubo incendios frecuentemente. Los trabajadores también se hirieron severamente con frecuencia, a veces hasta fatalmente, con la maquinaria. Perdieron manos, perdieron piernas, a veces pues murieron de sus heridas. So, kind of in reference to what you were asking about, Jiantan, it's not even just, is there a minimum wage? Are there any safety regulations? There are no safety regulations in those days. So factories were dirty and dangerous. There's a lot of dust in a textile mill. The processing of cotton and the making of fabric creates a lot of dust. So, and people are breathing that in. I believe they call that brown lung. There actually is a condition that people who work in textile mills can get called brown lung. Um, at night, they would light up these oil lamps, and they'd be right next to, big um, bundles of cotton. I can't remember how to say that. So there'd be, fire right next to these big bundles of cotton. And so there were frequently fires in the factory. And workers were hurt often on the heavy machinery. Sometimes they were even killed. So they would lose hands, they would lose feet, legs, fingers, and sometimes they lost their lives. And you have to remember that children are working in these conditions as well. It's not just adults. We have young children, really young, working in these conditions. All right. Los trabajadores y el movimiento laboral. So, empezando en 1821, las trabajadoras empezaron a hacer huelga para mejorar su situación. Los fabricantes bajaron sueldos y aumentaron la velocidad de la producción. So, ellas empezaron a hacer huelgas. All right, so starting in 1821. Oh, y también puse esto porque las primeras en empezar a luchar para mejores condiciones fueron las mujeres. So the first ones trying to improve conditions in the factories were women. Starting in 1821, the workers started doing work stoppages, mini strikes, or strikes to improve their situation because the factory owners lowered salaries and increased the speed of production. So they were expecting more output for less money. No tuvieron éxito al principio, pero sus esfuerzos representan los principios del movimiento laboral en los Estados Unidos. So these strikes didn't really have any success in the beginning. You could just take a whole, you could spend ages just studying the labor movement in the United States. So much happened. But this is the beginning of the labor movement in the United States. Los hombres también formaron un grupo llamado el Working Man's Party, so más como un partido político. El que lo empezó se llamaba Thomas Skidmore y él abogó, perdón, tengo que poner el acento, abogó por la abolición de la herencia. Él decía que la gente estaba heredando estaban heredando sus fortunas y que la otra gente estaba quedando sin, y abogaba la redistribución del... I can't think of how to say wealth, you guys. La redistribución del dinero, pues.
Riquezas.
De las riquezas, gracias. También abogó por la abolición de la prisión para los deudores que no podían pagar. En eso sí tuvo éxito en Nueva York. Después de que murió muy joven, pero después de que murió, el estado de Nueva York ya abolió las prisiones para deudores. Y él creía que sus ideas aplicaban igualmente a todos, no solo a hombres blancos. O sea, él estaba en contra del racismo, sexismo, todas esas discriminaciones que hay. All right. So, men also formed a group called the Working Men's Party. I think this was a little bit more like a political party. And someone named Thomas Skidmore advocated for the abolition of inheritance. So he believed that wealth needed to be redistributed, that the wealth was all staying in the hands of a very few. Does this sound familiar? Que las riquezas se quedan en las manos de pocos. ¿Suena familiar? So he's saying, we need to get rid of this being able to inherit so much wealth, and some people are being left out because of it. We need to redistribute the wealth. He also advocated for the abolition of debtors' prisons. In those days, most states had prisons where if you owed debt, you were thrown in prison um, if you couldn't pay. And although Skidmore died young, one success that he had was that shortly after he died, the state of New York did abolish debtors' prisons. And of course, we don't have those. Well, we kind of don't have them anymore. But they're sneaking back in their own way. He also believed that his ideas were for everybody. He did not believe in discrimination. He did not believe that only white men should have these rights. So, I guess he was an anti-racist and also anti-sexist as well, because he also believed that women should have these same rights. Estos movimientos no tenían mucho éxito debido al pánico económico de 1819 y a la inmigración de trabajadores irlandeses y alemanes que aceptaban peores condiciones con menos sueldo. So these are very early labor movements. They really didn't have much success. In part because we had the economic depression or the economic panic, our first economic depression in this country in 1819, and because of immigration from Ireland and Germany, and those people were willing to accept worse conditions with lower salaries. So they competed with American-born workers for work. All right. What does this say? La venta de los terrenos ajenos, el pánico de 1819 y los emprendedores e inventores. All right, so this little section, the selling of stolen land, I'm going to continue to say that when I talk about the government selling land, rather than keeping on going back and saying the land stolen from Native Americans. You can assume that's what I mean. The Panic of 1819, and entrepreneurs and inventors. So, el gobierno federal promulgaba la venta de los terrenos robados del noroeste. Pasaron varias leyes para la división y venta de los terrenos. Ustedes pueden ver en el capítulo si quieren saber los años y los términos de esas leyes. Pero era una serie de varios y después van a seguir más. So, esas leyes fijaban el tamaño y precio de las parcelas. Autorizaban al gobierno a hacer préstamos de interés bajo y autorizaban al gobierno a hacer préstamos de interés bajo. I'm finding so many mistakes. So, dividieron en parcelas más pequeñas para que más gente pudiera alcanzar las parcelas, right? Y luego, a través del tiempo, bajaron los precios de las parcelas también. So, the federal government promoted the sale of the stolen lands that were in the Northwest, the Ohio Territory and such, the Northwest Territory. They did this by passing laws to divide and sell the land. The laws basically fixed the size and price of the parcels. So if you remember from a previous chapter, they divided everything into a checkerboard, and then they divided each square into smaller squares. So over time, the government started authorizing smaller parcels, and the price of land actually that the government was selling it for actually went down over time. These laws also authorized the government to make low interest loans to people so that they could buy these parcels. So all of this stuff is going on. We've got the factories going. We've got the United States doing really well agriculturally because all the war in Europe meant that they hadn't been able to produce the agricultural products that they needed for themselves, so they were importing agricultural products from the United States to feed their people. Um, Factories are getting going, of course, down in the slaveholding South. They're happy using their stolen labor. And, people are moving out towards the Northwest Territories. People are, trying to find opportunities to get land and to do other things. And so everything seems to be going just fine. And then all of a sudden, the panic of 1819 hits. So, why? And these are the reasons why. So, todo va bien en el nuevo repúblico capitalista. Todo va bien. En Europa estaban todavía saliendo de tantas guerras y para poder darles de comer a sus ciudadanos necesitaban importar productos agrícolas de Estados Unidos, así que los granjeros de Estados Unidos tenían demanda para sus productos y los precios estaban bien. Um, Mucha gente estaba yendo al noroeste para tener esas oportunidades de tener terreno y de hacer su propia granja o su negocio. Um, las fábricas estaban empezando, la economía estaba muy bien y de repente el pánico de 1819. Esta es la primera depresión económica de los Estados Unidos y van a seguir después con regularidad. Y ustedes han vivido por lo menos una. Um, yo he vivido como que 3, 4, ni sé ya. Las razones. Los bancos estatales circulaban muchos billetes. ¿Por qué la gente estaba yendo a comprar terrenos? Necesitaban dinero para comprar los terrenos. Les hacían préstamos y les hacían billetes, pero no habían las monedas metálicas que respaldaban a esos billetes. Así que si un banco o un creditor quería su dinero en monedas metálicas, los bancos no hubieran podido pagar. Ese es un problema. Luego había habido mucha especulación en terrenos también. O sea, mucha gente que tenía dinero estaba comprando los terrenos y quedándose con ellos esperando que el precio subiera para poder venderlos en un precio más alto después. Pero hay que acordarnos que quizás habían pedido préstamos para comprar esos terrenos. Y si de repente hay problema con la moneda, entonces quizás ya no pueden pagar por sus terrenos y los van a perder, causando más problema. También en 1818 los precios de los productos agrícolas bajaron mucho debido a que Europa produjo más de lo esperado. O sea, ya habían salido de sus problemas de las guerras y ya empezaron a producir sus propios productos agrícolas y ya no necesitaban comprar de los Estados Unidos. Eso nos dejó en una depresión económica. Pusieron ejemplo de la ciudad de Filadelfia en que 75% de la población no tenía trabajo durante este tiempo. El gobierno federal intentó ayudar y los estados también, pasando leyes para no quitar los terrenos a la gente, quizás dándoles más tiempo pagar sus préstamos y otras cosas para ayudar. Okay, so the Panic of 1819. This is the first economic depression suffered in the United States. And afterwards they keep coming. So there's this boom and bust cycle that happens. And even in my own life, I think there have been 3 or 4 of these cycles. Uh, so you've probably experienced at least one. So basically, what was happening, state banks were circulating a lot of paper money. Neither the state nor the federal bank, state banks nor the federal bank had specie, in other words, the gold or silver that at the time paper money was backed by gold and silver by actually having that amount of gold and silver in stored someplace, right? Like in the mint. But because so many people were getting loans to buy land, uh, the states were making more paper money than they had specie to back it up. So this would create a problem if somebody suddenly wants their money back and they want it in gold or silver and not paper. All right. Also, there had been a lot of speculation on the land, so people were buying the land at low prices and hanging on to it and hoping to sell it back for a higher price later. This is another thing with which you are familiar. Gentrification, right? Um, People buying property and then waiting and hoping to sell it at a higher price. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Sometimes the price goes down. So the same thing happened then. If somebody bought land at a low price, but they took out a loan to buy it, and then they hoped later to sell it at a higher price, but they weren't even able to sell it for the price they originally paid for it, then they can't pay their loan, right? So people start to default on loans, and we've seen this happen in our time. The other thing that happened was that in 1818, agricultural products, the price went down very suddenly because Europe was able to produce more than what they expected. In other words, they were able to meet their own needs and they didn't need American imports to feed their people. This was because they finally came out of the effects of the war. So the federal government and the state governments too passed laws to try and help people. They don't. It doesn't help if everybody's losing their land and losing their means of survival. 75% of the population of Philadelphia was without work during this time. So the government passed laws to try and help people. Not allowing creditors to foreclose on people's loans, to take their homes or their land, um, increasing the amount of time for people to pay back the loan, uh, also selling smaller parcels for lower prices. So they did things to try and re-stimulate the economy. All right. Emprendedores e inventores. So, entrepreneurs and inventors. This is really a fun section in Chapter 9. I recommend reading the whole section because it talks about these different inventions and it's kind of interesting. I just kind of listed them. So, we've got Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, which the reason I put his name and didn't put anybody else's is because, ironically, Eli Whitney actually thought that his cotton gin would replace slavery. He thought that slavery would be unnecessary. Well, it was never really necessary, but he thought that it would be rendered obsolete by his machine because his machine could do all this work that slaves were doing. Unfortunately, ironically, that's not what happened, right? Things actually, it increased the demand for cotton and thereby increased the use of slave labor. Poor Eli Whitney. We never know what's going to happen. You can't predict what's going to happen with things. We also have the steamboat, and the steam locomotive. I didn't put that here, but the steamboat. They mention the steam locomotive in the next section. We have the mechanical reaper, which takes the place of people using a scythe and harvesting wheat by hand. And we have the telegraph and the Morse code. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, where this code can be sent over a wire. And so now we can communicate over long distances without having to be there or send a letter. We can communicate instantly, almost, over long distances, which is a huge revolution. Okay, so emprendedores e inventores. Solo puse el nombre de Eli Whitney. Hubiera puesto de Samuel Morse también, pero porque me gustó lo que él esperaba. So, él hizo la despepitadora de algodón. Irónicamente, él esperaba que esa máquina reemplazara la esclavitud. Él pensó que como esta máquina puede sacar las pepitas del algodón, ya no van a necesitar que la gente lo haga, y así ya no van a querer el labor de los esclavos. Pero desafortunadamente lo que pasó es que la demanda para el algodón subió, y hasta la esclavitud ganó más fuerza. También el buque a vapor se inventó durante este tiempo, y el locomotriz, no sé cómo decirlo, pero el tren a vapor también, que vamos a hablar en la siguiente sección.
Locomotora.
Locomotora, gracias, a vapor. Y luego el segador mecánico, que es lo que hace la cosecha del trigo, por ejemplo, en vez de una persona con una hoz cortándolo individualmente, ya tienen esta máquina que va detrás de un caballo y que corta mucho a la vez. O también los molinos de trigo, también. Y luego el telégrafo por Samuel Morse y el código Morse. Y esa es una revolución si uno lo piensa, porque en aquellos tiempos tenían cartas y visitas para poder comunicar, ¿no? Y ahora tienen algo que es casi instantáneo, que se va a través de un alambre. All right. And I think that's it. Yes. Okay. Deja guardar la grabación.